My 75th birthday should have felt like a celebration. I should have been surrounded by the warm laughter of family, wrapped in the familiar scent of home-cooked dishes, with little ones running barefoot down the hallway like they used to. Instead, the house felt cold, too clean, too arranged like a showroom meant to impress people I didn't quite recognize anymore. The cake came out at exactly 6 p.m., topped with those gaudy sparkling candles someone insisted were festive. I blew them out quickly before the silence could stretch too long, and people clapped like they were checking a box. I scanned the faces around the table. Some were familiar by blood, others by obligation, but one face was missing his. My son. My only son. I didn't say anything then. I smiled. I took photos. I posed with people I hadn't spoken to since the last forced gathering. They handed me gift bags with tissue paper puffed up like icing. I opened them, said thank you, and watched as my words landed like feathers on polished hardwood floors. No one noticed that I kept glancing toward the door. No one offered an explanation. They moved through the motions. Plates were passed, wine was poured. Compliments were given about how well I was holding up. Someone said I didn't look a day over 65. I laughed even though it felt like the sort of joke meant to pat itself on the back. I sat in my favorite armchair after the guests had moved to the patio, and for a moment I closed my eyes. I listened, not to the clinking glasses or the polite murmurs, but to the absence. My son's laughter used to be easy to spot in a room, loud, a little bit brash, but honest. Today, there was no trace of it, not in the house, not even in a birthday card. The nurse they had hired her to help with little things. She had kind eyes, always soft with concern but never pitying. She handed me a warm cup of tea with her usual, quiet attentiveness. "Happy birthday," she whispered like it was a sacred offering. I looked at her and said thank you, and for the first time that day I meant it. Her presence didn't fill the room, but it made the silence feel less cruel. I didn't ask her about my son. I didn't ask anyone. But the absence spoke. It carved a hollow space between the roast chicken and the string lights, and no one dared name it. Later, when the guests had gone, and the house was being half-heartedly tidied, I overheard someone in the kitchen say, "It was just easier without him." Easier. That word stung like vinegar on an old wound. Since when did easier replace family? I went to bed early that night, though I didn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling fan, spinning shadows across my walls. My mind played through every birthday. I could remember my son with cake on his cheeks at age 5, trying to blow out candles before I could finish singing. Him in his 20s, half drunk, and still managing to hug me tighter than anyone else. Even 10 years ago he'd made the effort, even if he had come late and left early. Now there was nothing. I told myself I must have forgotten something, that surely there was a voicemail I hadn't checked, or a message lost in the confusion. But I knew better. The silence wasn't accidental. It was chosen. And it wasn't his choice alone. There was a shadow in the room that night, and it wasn't age. It was something deeper. A fracture in the floorboards of family. A split that had been widening for years. And maybe, just maybe, my 75th birthday was the moment it became too wide to step over. The morning after my birthday, I moved more slowly than usual, not because of my knees or the weather, but because of something heavier, something I didn't yet have words for. I stood by the kitchen window stirring my tea without really drinking it, watching the light stretch across the backyard. The lemon tree was blooming again. My son used to pick lemons from it for me when he was a boy. He'd bring them in with both hands like he was carrying treasure. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else now. I didn't plan to ask about him. I wasn't ready to hear what I already suspected. But sometimes the truth doesn't wait for you. It just shows up, uninvited. I was still in my robe when I heard the voices in the laundry room, whispered like they knew better. But the thing about being old is that people forget how sharp your ears can be, especially when your heart is already tuned to a specific frequency. She told him not to come, one said it'd make things awkward, that it was better for everyone if he stayed away. Another voice added, "Well, you know how he is. Always stirs things up." She didn't want any drama. I stood very still. I felt the words wrap around my spine like a cold rope. She told him not to come. Not he forgot, not he was out of town, but he was told to stay away. And worse, to avoid drama. As if I was the stage and he the performer. As if my birthday was a polite performance with no room for unscripted love. I walked back to my room without making a sound. The tea was still in my hand, untouched, cooling now. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the pattern on the carpet. How many things had I been kept from? How many little decisions had been made around me like I was a fragile ornament? They were all too tired of dusting. That afternoon, the nurse came in to check on me. She asked gently if I'd like to go outside for some fresh air. I nodded, more for her sake than mine. We sat on the back porch. She didn't push conversation. That was one of the things I liked about her. She let silence have a place, too. I finally asked, "Did you notice he wasn't here?" Her eyes met mine, steady and kind. "Yes," she said, "just that." I nodded. "Did you hear why?" She hesitated for a breath, then said softly, "Sometimes people make decisions out of fear, not love." It wasn't confirmation, but it was enough, and somehow her answer held more grace than any apology could. We sat there for a while. The wind moved through the orange blossoms, and the neighbor's dog barked distantly. Life went on outside my little heartbreak. But inside me something shifted, not into anger, not yet, into clarity, a kind of cold clarity that no longer made excuses on behalf of others. My son had been pushed out, erased, maybe because he didn't fit into the picture someone else was trying to paint, maybe because he had questioned something that made others uncomfortable. I didn't know the whole story yet, but I knew enough. Enough to feel betrayed. I spent the next few hours replaying the day before, looking for signs I'd missed, the way no one mentioned his name, the sudden change of subject when I brought up the old vacation photos, the empty chair at the end of the table. How had I been so blind? Or maybe more accurately, how long had I been choosing to look away? It hurt. Of course it hurt. But underneath the hurt, there was something else forming, a quiet kind of resolve. I had spent years believing that family would always mean presence, that blood would show up. But now I saw it clearly. Sometimes family meant being left out of your own celebration. Sometimes family meant being conveniently forgotten. I looked at the nurse again. She was watching the birds with a gentle interest, like someone who still found magic in the ordinary. She was 25, maybe 26, younger than my own grandchildren. But she carried herself with a kind of patience I hadn't felt from my own kin in years. "I don't think they see me anymore," I said out loud. She looked at me, not with pity, but with understanding. "I do," she said. And that small sentence cracked something open. There's a certain kind of pain that doesn't come all at once. It arrives in fragments, like pieces of overheard conversations, like the way someone avoids your eyes, like the soft closing of a door that used to be left open. That week the whispers multiplied, not always in words, sometimes in glances, sometimes in how quickly the topic changed when I walked into a room. I had become a ghost in my own home, a figure people stepped around, spoke over, managed. It was the third morning after the party when I stood in the kitchen alone, making myself toast. I liked it a certain way, slightly burnt, buttered edge to edge. no one made it like I did, and no one cared to remember. I heard them before they saw me. 2 voices, my daughter-in-law and one of her friends. Their tone was hushed, but pointed sharpened with the kind of confidence people have when they're certain the subject isn't listening. She's not really all there anymore, you know. I mean, she still dresses herself, sure, but mentally she's not what she used to be. Then the laugh, that thin, sharp laugh that cuts through your spine. Oh, totally. Did you see her at the party lost in her own living room? And she kept asking about him, like it wasn't obvious he wasn't coming. I didn't move. I just stood there, hand on the toaster heart, frozen. The butter knife trembled slightly in my grip. They continued talking as if I were a floor lamp, as if I had become part of the furniture, aged, outdated, not worth consulting. My hearing was supposed to be failing after all. But I heard everything. She should really consider moving out, one said. It's not like she needs this big house. Honestly, if it weren't for the nurse, she wouldn't manage half of it. The other one sighed. They'll get her there eventually. She won't fight it. They left without realizing I had heard every syllable. And I stood still long after the toaster popped. The toast was burnt black now, but I didn't care. I was still processing the quiet violence of their words, not what they said because I had feared it already, but how easily they said it, how casually they erased me from my own life. I sat in the breakfast nook for a long time that morning. No newspaper, no TV, just me, the burnt toast, and a deep ache in my chest. It wasn't just sadness, it was humiliation. I had given everything to this family. I had put dreams on hold, worked double shifts, worn the same shoes until the soles thinned so they could have more, so they could feel safe and cared for. Now I was something they were trying to transition, something to be moved, managed, softened into silence. I didn't cry. I didn't even speak. But I made a decision that morning without knowing it. A seed was planted. Later that day, the nurse checked on me. "You haven't eaten," she said. I shook my head. "Not hungry." She didn't press. Instead, she made me a fresh piece of toast, just the way I liked it. Burnt, but not too much. Butter to the edges. She placed it in front of me without asking, sat across the table and waited, not to be thanked, not to be praised, just to be present. She wasn't part of my family. She had no obligation to me beyond a paycheck. But that small gesture, a piece of toast, made the way I liked, felt more loving than any of the gifts I'd opened 3 nights ago. And in that moment, something became clear. It wasn't the size of the house or the blood in your veins that made a person family. It was how they made you feel when no one else was looking. It was whether they saw your soul, not just your wrinkles. The whispers in the kitchen hadn't broken me, but they had made something inside me start to wake up, a kind of quiet rage, a kind of sorrow so deep it started turning into strength. I wasn't going to let them decide what happened next. She had only been working here for a few months, but somehow it felt like she had always belonged, not in the way you say someone fits into a household rhythm, but in the way certain songs feel like memories, even the first time you hear them. She didn't fill the space with noise, and maybe that's what made her presence so different from the others. Everyone else seemed to move with the energy of trying to get something done, fix something, control something. She moved with a kind of quiet purpose, never rushing, never talking over me, never making me feel like a task on a checklist. She helped me with the little things. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and the arthritis in my fingers had started to make buttons and clasps feel like puzzles designed to frustrate. One morning I struggled with the tiny pearl buttons on the back of my blouse, the kind I used to wear to church when I still went. I didn't want to ask for help. I never did. But somehow she knew. She knocked softly, came in, and without a word stood behind me and began fastening them one by one with the same care I remember using on my son's shirts when he was a boy and still let me dress him before school. Her hands were gentle, but they held a steadiness that comforted me. Like she carried within her a calmness I had long forgotten. I glanced at her reflection in the mirror. She wasn't smiling out of politeness. It was something else, something quieter, kinder. When she finished, she gently adjusted the collar and said, "Beautiful." No one had called me that in years. Later that day, I watched her from the hallway as she folded laundry, not with the mechanical speed of someone trying to be done, but with the mindfulness of someone who believed small things deserved care. She smoothed out the corners, aligned the edges, folded, even my old nightgowns with the kind of respect people usually reserve for more expensive things. Watching her, I realized something strange. She treated my things better than my family treated me. She saw me not as a burden, not as someone who needed managing, but as a person, with a past, with value, with stories still worth hearing. One evening, as she helped me settle into bed, I asked her if she had a grandmother. Her eyes softened. I did. She raised me. I still dream of her sometimes. I nodded. She must have been special. She smiled, but her eyes glistened just a little. She taught me how to love gently. Those words wrapped around me like a warm shawl. How to love gently. I lay there in the dark, listening to the silence, feeling something open in my chest, a slow unfolding like a letter left unopened too long. For so long I had been clutching my hurt close to the bone. I didn't trust people anymore. I didn't believe anyone saw me unless they needed something from me. But she, this young woman with calm eyes and steady hands, was showing me another way, not with grand gestures, just consistent kindness. That night I dreamt of my son as a child. He was sitting in my lap asking me to tell him the story about the moon who got lonely. He used to love that one. I'd tell it with exaggerated voices, and he would giggle and nestle into my chest. In the dream, he reached up and touched my face the way only little children do, like you're made of stars. I woke up crying. I sat in bed for a while before calling out. When she came in, she brought tea without asking. She didn't ask why my eyes were red. She just sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Want me to sit for a bit?" I nodded. She stayed until the tea cooled. In that silence, something inside me shifted. I realized I hadn't just been grieving the distance between me and my son. I was grieving the part of me that had accepted being forgotten, that had slowly allowed myself to be erased. But now there was someone who looked at me like I still mattered. And that meant maybe, just maybe, I could start looking at myself that way again too. It happened 3 days after the birthday in the smallest, quietest of ways. We were having dessert after dinner, a simple vanilla bean ice cream I used to make from scratch back when I still had the strength to churn and strain and freeze it with salt and patience. These days they bought it from the store, but I ate it anyway. Not for the flavor, but for the memory. I sat at the end of the table, quietly waiting as plates were passed. Conversation buzzed on without me talk about someone's promotion, a neighbor's divorce, the rising cost of groceries. I didn't mind not speaking. I had gotten used to being a presence rather than a participant. But then the nurse brought me my bowl, 2 small scoops gently melting. She placed a silver spoon beside it and gave me a soft smile before moving back toward the kitchen. Almost immediately someone hissed, "She's not supposed to use that one." There was a brief moment of tension, short, sharp, almost comical in how serious it felt for such a small thing. "It's the good set," said my daughter-in-law, "the silver, not for everyday use." The nurse froze for a second. She turned to me, apologetic, unsure. "I'm sorry, I didn't know," she said softly. I looked at the spoon, heavy, ornate, the one with the slight bend in the handle. My husband had given me that set for our 25th anniversary. We used to say it was for guests, though over time no one came and it stayed boxed up like treasure we were afraid to enjoy. "It's fine," I said, but no one heard me. Or maybe they pretended not to. "It's just, we don't want anything getting ruined," my daughter-in-law continued, her voice sharp at the edges. No offense, of course. None taken because I'd already stopped feeling anything. They swapped the spoon. The nurse looked ashamed. I sat there holding the cold bowl, watching the ice cream slowly turn to milk. No one met my eyes. The conversation resumed as though the moment had never happened, but I was changed by it. Not because of the spoon, but because of what it meant. I was no longer allowed to touch what was once mine, not the good silver, not the decisions, not even my own birthday invitations. I was a guest in my own home, a liability to their aesthetics, a figure to be handled gently but not fully trusted with the porcelain. The nurse returned later to help me into my robe. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said. "You didn't," I replied. "You reminded me." She looked confused. I didn't explain. But what I meant was, she reminded me of how far I had drifted from ownership of my own life, how deeply I had been folded into the linens packed away, like the silver only brought out when someone else decided it was safe. That night I walked to the old hutch in the dining room. I opened the cabinet where the silver was kept still in its velvet-lined box. I traced my finger along the polished fork handles, remembering every dinner where they had been laid out with pride. They weren't sacred. They were symbols. And now they were no longer mine to offer. I closed the box gently. I didn't take anything, but I made another decision in the stillness of that moment. If I could not be trusted with a spoon, I would no longer trust them with my soul. The next morning I asked the nurse if she had time for tea. We sat together quietly, hands wrapped around steaming mugs. I looked her in the eyes and asked, "Do you ever think of staying?" She blinked. "Staying?" "Living here," I said. "Not just working, not just passing through." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't say no either. And something about that silence felt like the beginning of something honest. That afternoon I found myself drifting toward the family room. Not out of habit, but out of need. The way a wounded animal finds the shade of a tree, I sought a place that still remembered me. The shelves were still lined with frames, portraits from years gone by, dusty but proud. School graduations, old vacations, birthdays, long before the tension crept in. I reached for an album on the bottom shelf, the blue one with the torn corner. It was one of the few things in the house no one touched anymore. Too old, too uncurated for their clean lines and neutral palettes. I brought it to the couch and opened it on my lap. The first photo stopped me, my son, age 7, missing a front tooth, hugging a puppy we couldn't afford, but bought anyway. His eyes were bright, and he looked like the world had not yet made a decision about him. I touched the edge of the photo gently. There was my handwriting, scrawled in pen, Daisy's first day. I turned the page, my husband holding my hand at a picnic, his eyes laughing though his face was tired. We had so little back then, but everything in those pictures felt whole. I kept flipping. My son on a bicycle, my son in a school play, my son asleep on my chest, barely a toddler, clutching a faded stuffed bear that we still kept in the attic. A lump rose in my throat as I realized no one else ever looked at these anymore. No one came to this room unless they needed something. It had become a museum of a woman they no longer asked about. They called me forgetful, but I remembered everything. And maybe that was the problem. I remembered how much I sacrificed, how many birthdays I worked through, how many nights I stayed up sewing costumes, waiting by the phone, sending care packages he never asked for but always thanked me for. I remembered defending him even when he made mistakes. I remembered the hard conversations, the tears, the reconciliation, the growth, all of it. And now they talked about him like he was a variable that made the equation too messy. But in this room he still lived. Not the man they pushed out, but the boy who once brought me a flower crown made of dandelions and called me Queen Mom for an entire week. He saw me then. In his eyes, I wasn't a burden. I was the center of the world. I sat there for hours. At some point, the nurse came in carrying a basket of folded towels. She paused when she saw me in the open album. She walked over quietly and asked, "May I?" I nodded. She sat beside me and we looked through the photos together. I didn't explain each one. She didn't need the commentary. She studied the images the way people study paintings in a gallery, thoughtfully, respectfully, as if what she was seeing mattered. "This is your son?" she asked softly. "Yes," I said. "He looks like someone who was deeply loved." I swallowed hard. "He was," I whispered. "Still is, even now." She closed the album slowly, respectfully. "You have a beautiful history," she said. I nodded, my throat tight. But history's no good if no one believes it ever happened. She looked at me, then her voice firmer than I'd ever heard it. "I believe it. I see it in you." And I realized in that moment how starved I'd been for someone to believe in my story, to look at me and not just see an old woman in a robe, but a mother who had lived. Not one person from my family had ever asked to sit and go through these albums with me. They were more interested in the renovations, in how to turn the back room into an office, in what to sell and what to keep for sentiment. I was the sentiment, and they had already moved on. But she hadn't. She stayed there beside me long after the light had changed, and as we sat in that dusty room surrounded by echoes of laughter and days too far gone, something inside me began to stitch itself back together. Because love once given does not disappear. It may be hidden in pages. It may be buried beneath years of neglect. But it waits. And someone had finally come looking for it. That night, I didn't turn on the lamp. I let the room fall into shadow, the way dusk always does, slowly at first, then all at once. I sat in the armchair by the window, the one with the faded arms and the cushion that never quite fluffed right anymore. Outside, the world continued in its usual rhythm. The neighbor's porch light blinked on a dog, barked twice. The wind moved through the tall eucalyptus trees. Inside, the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away, and the occasional creak of old wood settling beneath old memories. It had been a long time since I'd allowed myself to sit with my thoughts. No television to distract. No magazine open to pretend I was reading. Just me. Just the truth. I held a photo in my lap. One I had taken earlier from the family room. My son at age 10 sitting beside me on the front steps. Both of us in matching overalls. Both laughing at something just outside the frame. I remembered that moment. We had been laughing at the dog chasing his tail. It had started to rain that day, and we ran inside, squealing with joy. It was one of those afternoons that was utterly ordinary, and yet it had taken permanent residence in my heart. I stared at that photo, now tracing the lines of his young face, and I asked myself softly, how did we get here? The question lingered in the quiet. I didn't expect an answer. Maybe there wasn't just one. Maybe it had been years of small moments of silence, where words should have been of assumptions instead of conversations of drifting, rather than anchoring. And maybe I had allowed it. Maybe in trying to keep the peace I had slowly surrendered, all the pieces of myself that had once been solid. I thought about the things I had let go of, my garden, my volunteer work, my painting supplies that now sat dry and brittle in the garage. Little by little, they told me I should rest more, do less sit down. I didn't argue. It felt easier to go along, but ease, I now realized, is not the same as love. Sometimes ease is what people give you when they're too tired to offer effort. And then one day you wake up and realize you've become a painting hung in someone else's hallway. Still, quiet, looked at, but not seen. I exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to stretch into every corner of my chest. Then I said the words I'd never said out loud before: I am not fragile. Not the way they treated me, not the way they whispered about me in kitchens. I was older, yes, slower, but I was also a woman who had raised a child, buried a husband, nursed others through illness and grief, held down jobs when there was barely enough to pay the mortgage, and still found time to make Halloween costumes by hand. That is not fragility. That is ferocity in slow motion. The room stayed silent, but something stirred in me like a hand on my back that I hadn't felt in years, maybe my own. I stood slowly and crossed the room to the desk. I opened the drawer and pulled out an old notebook. Inside it were lists, birthdays, family recipes, emergency contacts, things that once meant continuity. I turned the page and began a new list, only this time I titled it "What Still Belongs to Me." I wrote slowly: my voice, my choices, my memories, my name, my love. I stared at those words. 5 simple things. But together they were everything I needed to remember. I closed the notebook and placed it on the table beside my bed. When the nurse came in to check on me before sleep, she noticed the lamp was still off. "Do you want me to turn it on?" she asked gently. "No," I said. "Let's let the dark have its say tonight." She smiled and tucked the blanket around my shoulders. As she reached the door, I said softly, "Would you sit with me for a minute?" She nodded and returned, pulling the second chair close. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. I just let the silence wrap around us like a shawl woven of truth and time. And somewhere in that quiet, I stopped feeling alone. That was the night I decided something would change, not out of bitterness, but out of remembrance. I had spent too long shrinking in the shadows of people who had forgotten my light. Now I was ready to step back into it. The next morning began with the smell of toast, not the burnt kind I loved, but the bland kind they preferred just slightly, golden dry, unsalted. I stayed in bed longer than usual, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to see if anyone would come looking for me. No one did. Eventually I pulled on my robe, the soft blue one with the frayed sleeve, and made my way to the living room. She was there already tidying up, folding a blanket that had fallen from the couch. The nurse looked up and smiled when she saw me. Not that tight-lipped, obligatory smile so many give the elderly. Hers was full, open, a welcome. "You slept in," she said gently. I nodded. Felt like one of those mornings. She didn't press. Instead, she stepped toward the kitchen and returned with a fresh cup of tea chamomile with just a hint of honey. My favorite. I hadn't asked for it, but she remembered. I took it in both hands, letting the heat sink into my skin. Then she did something no one else had done in months. She sat. Not perched, not half standing like she was on her way out. She sat beside me on the couch, tucked her leg under the other, and turned to face me like we had nowhere else to be. It was a simple gesture, almost forgettable. But to me, it felt like someone had just reopened a door that had long been closed. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly. I nodded again. When people stop listening, the words stop forming. She didn't rush to respond. She just looked at me with the kind of stillness that made space for truth. I sipped my tea and watched the dust float in the morning sun. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "Why do you stay?" My voice was quieter than I expected. "You're young, bright. You could be anywhere doing anything. Why here?" She didn't answer right away. She looked toward the window as though the trees might help her find the words. Then she turned back to me. "I stay because people forget the power of being present, and I don't want to forget." Her voice caught slightly. When my grandmother got older, I saw how invisible she became. People spoke over her, around her. Decisions were made for her, not with her. She used to sit in her kitchen and make the same tea every afternoon, even when no one came to drink it. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry despite the tea. "I come here," she continued, "because I see you, and I think it matters, that you are seen." A stillness settled in the room, one I didn't want to break. I thought of how long it had been since anyone had truly sat with me, not to get something, not to ask for money or a signature or an opinion only to ignore it, just to be here, with me. I set my cup down and reached across the small space between us. My hand found hers. She didn't flinch. She held it. We sat like that for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 50. Time softened around us. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I told her a story. Not because it was relevant, not because it was prompted, but because I wanted to. I told her about the time I accidentally locked my son in the garage during a thunderstorm when he was 6, and how he had forgiven me by the time I opened the door. 5 minutes later, tears already dried, because he trusted me to come back. She laughed, not out of politeness, but real laughter, the kind that rises like warm bread. "You must have loved him a lot," she said. "I still do," I replied. Her expression shifted just slightly. "Then why doesn't he come?" I looked down at our joined hands, because somewhere along the way I loved him louder than was convenient, and now, maybe that's a noise they'd rather silence. She didn't answer that, but she didn't let go. And that was enough. That morning changed something. It didn't fix the past, and it didn't erase the hurt, but it reminded me of something I hadn't felt in years. I was still worthy of witness, and in a world where so many drift through without ever being truly seen, that is a kind of resurrection. It didn't happen all at once. There was no great revelation, no thunderclap of justice. It came in soft ripples, thoughts that rose in the quiet moments, between the nurse's visits, between the scraped plates and the folding of towels, thoughts that whispered louder than the voices of my family ever had. What if the things I left behind didn't have to go to the ones who had already turned their backs? What if love, real love, earned its way into legacy? I had spent most of my life believing that blood came first, that no matter the hurt, no matter the cold shoulders, the whispered insults, the uninvited birthdays, my son would still be my son. My things would still be his to inherit. That was how it had to be, right? But I wasn't so sure anymore. I thought of that silver spoon, the one they snatched from my bowl, like it was some royal artifact I had sullied by daring to touch. I thought of the way they walked through the halls of this house like it was already theirs, not with reverence, but with calculation, measuring, planning, removing pieces of me one drawer at a time. They didn't ask what I wanted, they assumed. And assumption, I'd learned, is just another word for erasure. One afternoon, I pulled the old will from the safe. My hands trembled not with age, but with clarity. It was dated nearly 15 years ago, before my husband passed back when my son still called 3 times a week and ended each conversation with "Love you, Mom." I read through the lines. House to him, savings to him, he was executor beneficiary blood. It all made sense. Then. Now I saw it for what it was, a story that no longer fit. I didn't grab a pen, not yet. But I did close the folder and place it in the center of my desk, like a question waiting to be answered. That evening, as the sun turned the walls golden and soft, I watched the nurse from the hallway. She was kneeling on the floor of the living room, helping reorganize the bottom shelf of books, not because anyone asked her to, but because she'd noticed the dust. Her movements were careful, respectful, as though she understood the stories within those bindings mattered, even if no one read them anymore. I thought about what I could give her, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because she gave presence, because she gave care, and because she gave dignity to me and to this house. I thought about what that meant, what it meant to reward that kind of love with more than a thank you and a paycheck. I imagined her living here, really living here. Maybe she would take care of the garden. Maybe she'd fill the rooms with the kind of laughter that doesn't feel rehearsed. Maybe she'd sit in the same chair I was sitting in now years from now and remember the quiet hours we spent together. And maybe, just maybe, she'd remember me not as a client, or a task or a fading shadow in the hallway, but as the woman who finally chose her own ending. That night I asked her a quiet question as she brought me tea. "Do you believe people can choose their family?" She looked surprised, but not confused. "Yes," she said. "I think it's the only family that really lasts." I nodded. My eyes stung, but I didn't cry. I just said, "Good," because I think I've already chosen mine. She sat beside me. She didn't ask for details. She didn't press. She just took my hand as she had done so many times now, and let her silence speak the kind of acceptance no document ever could. I knew then absolutely that I would rewrite the will. Not to punish, not to shock, not even to hurt, but to honor the person who had seen me when others only saw my years. Some inherit by name, others by heart. And I was ready to write a legacy that finally matched the truth. There was a time, not too long ago really, when the sound of the phone ringing made my heart leap. Every Sunday afternoon, like clockwork, the phone would buzz, and it would be him, my son. His voice always began the same. "Hey, Ma, how's your week?" And no matter how busy I had been, no matter how small the updates, I'd always find a way to make it feel like we were sitting across from each other in the kitchen sipping coffee and sharing life. But then the calls changed. First they got shorter. "Hey Ma, just checking in real quick." 5 minutes instead of 15. A few quick lines about work. A joke or two. Gotta run. Then they got less frequent, not every Sunday, then not every other, then silence. I excused it for a long time. He's busy. The kids are in school. His wife probably needs him more right now. I told myself everything, except the one truth I didn't want to face. He was choosing not to call. I still waited every Sunday, though. I'd get dressed a little nicer, put the house in order as if he might show up at the door. I'd sit in my chair by the window and listen to the phone not ringing, and somehow the silence always sounded louder than any ringtone could. Eventually I stopped dressing up, but I never stopped hoping. I think part of me believed that if I just kept waiting, he'd come back to me. Not physically, maybe, but emotionally, spiritually, as the boy who once held my hand during thunderstorms, as the young man who cried on my shoulder the night his heart was first broken, as the son who used to say, "You're the only one who really gets me, Ma." I kept those moments like heirlooms, polished them with memory, protected them from time, and yet he drifted further. I tried to reach out, of course, left voicemails, wrote little cards on holidays, sent recipes I knew he used to love folded in handwritten notes. I wasn't begging, I just didn't know how else to say I still want to know you. And then slowly something started to die inside me. Not love, love never dies, but the belief that it would ever be returned. The last time I spoke to him months ago, he seemed distracted, polite, but rushed. I asked about the kids. He gave one-word answers. I asked when he might come visit, and he said, "We'll try, but things are hectic right now." The call lasted 3 minutes and 22 seconds. He didn't ask how I was. That was the part that ached deepest. Not that he was busy, not that he had other priorities, but that I no longer registered as one. So when the nurse began to sit beside me each day, when she remembered my stories, when she brought my tea the way I liked it without asking, I started to feel something I hadn't in years. Seen, cherished, valued. She didn't owe me anything. That's what made it matter more. And that's when I began to realize that being someone's mother did not guarantee being someone's person. Blood made us family, but it hadn't made us close, not in a long time. One day, I opened the drawer where I kept the birthday cards. His handwriting used to be so messy, so unmistakably his. I found one from 10 years ago, written in blue ink. "To the strongest, kindest woman I know, love you forever, Ma." I touched the words, trying to summon him from them, but all I felt was distance. Maybe it was life. Maybe it was her, his wife. Maybe it was something broken in him that I could never fix. But either way, the calls had stopped, and I had learned to stop waiting for the phone to ring. Instead, I had started listening to the person who was here. The nurse had no promises to break, no history to betray. She was here now in the present, and that mattered more than every silent Sunday that had come before. The son who stopped calling didn't know what he was missing, but I did. And I was no longer willing to keep handing my heart to an echo. It sat at the edge of the property, overgrown and half swallowed by weeds. Once it had been my sanctuary. The garden was where I had gone when the house felt too loud or too quiet, where I taught my son how to recognize basil from mint, how to plant marigolds to keep the aphids away. We had dug those first beds together, he no more than 10 years old, his hands in the dirt beside mine, proud of every worm we uncovered, every sprout we coaxed from seed. He used to love it. He named the tomatoes. He made little signs for the carrots, and when they finally burst through the soil, he carried them inside, like trophies, holding them up to the light, as if he'd won something precious. But now the garden was still. The fence leaned. The roses were choked by ivy. The lemon tree bore fruit no one picked anymore. I stood on the porch and looked out at it, one afternoon, cup of tea in hand, and wondered how it had become a graveyard for things once nurtured. It had happened slowly. After my husband passed, I tried to keep it up, but my knees weren't what they used to be. My hands would cramp in the cold. My son had promised to help. He said, "We'll come every month, Ma. I'll bring the kids. We'll clean it up together." That was 4 years ago. They came once. After that, it was always next month when things calmed down. Or, "It's just been a crazy week, Ma." At first I offered gentle reminders. Then I stopped. I thought maybe if I didn't ask, he'd remember on his own. But he didn't, and the garden kept growing wild, forgotten, tangled like the silence between us. That afternoon I stepped outside, slowly, carefully holding the rail as I walked down the steps. The earth was soft beneath my slippers. I made my way to the far bed where the lavender used to bloom. I knelt, despite the protest in my joints, and pulled at the weeds, just a few. Just enough to see the cracked soil beneath. The nurse nurse found me there 20 minutes later, her voice soft with worry. "You should have called me." I smiled a little, breathless. I wanted to see what was still alive. She didn't scold me. Instead, she knelt beside me and looked around. "It's got good bones," she said, brushing dirt from a corner stone. "We could bring it back." I blinked at her. "You'd help me?" "Of course." Something in my chest opened, not with sadness, not with regret, but with possibility. We spent the next few days doing small things, clearing dead leaves, trimming what we could. I couldn't do much, but she never made me feel like I was slowing her down. She asked questions about every plant, what they were, what they needed, what they used to look like in bloom. And I answered with a joy I hadn't felt in years. It felt like remembering how to breathe. One morning, she showed up with a tray of young seedlings. "Thought we could start fresh," she said. "Maybe basil. You can tell me if I'm doing it all wrong." I laughed a real full laugh that surprised even me. "You're doing it exactly right." As we worked together, I kept thinking how strange it was that someone who had no memory of this space was the one who cared enough to bring it back, and how someone who had once loved it most had let it go without a glance. That garden was never about vegetables. It was a place to tend things, to care, to pay attention. And in the end, it became the perfect metaphor. Because love, like a garden, cannot survive on intention alone. It needs presence. Hands in the dirt, knees on the ground, time. My son had forgotten the garden, but she remembered without ever knowing. And in her care, I remembered who I used to be too. Not just a woman waiting by a phone or a guest in her own house, but a mother who had taught love with her hands in the earth, and a woman who still had more to give. It had been a week since my birthday. The balloons had gone limp in the trash. The cake was long eaten, and the compliments that once filled the air now echoed only as memory. Most people had moved on back to their routines, their plans, their lives, where I was more concept than concern. But something had shifted quietly inside of me. Something unwrapped, not with paper or ribbon, but with presence. A gift that arrived without announcement. It was a Wednesday morning. The kind of morning where the sun spilled onto the kitchen floor in honey-colored pools. The nurse had made coffee, real coffee, not the watery kind they insisted I drink now, and she poured me a cup without asking, just the way I liked it, dark hot, a little sugar. I looked at the steam rising and felt a strange ache behind my ribs. She handed it to me and said, "You seemed like you needed something strong today." I nodded. "It's perfect." Then she brought a small box from her coat pocket, a plain little thing wrapped in brown paper and string. "I know I missed your actual birthday," she said, a bit shy, but this felt right. I opened it slowly. Inside was a seed packet lavender, the kind that used to line the back fence. Alongside it was a small photo frame. The picture inside was one I didn't recognize at first, me laughing in the garden, my sleeves rolled up, my hands covered in soil. She must have taken it just days ago. My mouth was open, mid-laugh, my eyes crinkled with something I hadn't seen in the mirror for years' light. "I thought you might want to remember what you look like when you're free," she said. I couldn't speak. I stared at the photo, the seed packet trembling in my hands. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything. She had seen me, not as someone to manage, not as someone fading, but as someone still becoming. That day I finally allowed myself to feel what I had been keeping at bay since the party grief, but not just for my son's absence. It was deeper than that. I grieved the woman I had become without noticing, the one who had stopped planting, stopped laughing, stopped expecting anything beautiful. And then, like a breeze passing through a closed room, came a realization I had been waiting for someone to give me permission to live again. But maybe all I ever needed was to choose it. This woman beside me, this nurse with steady hands and thoughtful silences, had given me more than care. She had given me back myself. It wasn't duty that brought her to me. It wasn't inheritance. It wasn't guilt or blood or pressure. It was just presence. Consistent, deliberate, honest presence. In that moment, I made a decision. The kind of decision that doesn't come with a bang, but with a quiet click, like a key finally turning in the right lock. I would give her the house, not as revenge, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a thank you, because every corner of this home had been kept alive by her care, not the ones who had left me out of my own birthday, not the ones who spoke about me as if I were already gone. She hadn't asked for anything, and yet she had already given me the greatest gift, the chance to feel like someone worth staying for. That evening I called my lawyer. He didn't question my decision. He only asked if I was sure. "I've never been more sure," I said. He told me he'd draft everything by the end of the week. I hung up and walked outside. The lavender bed was cleared now, waiting for seeds. The frame sat on my nightstand, and I looked at it often, not to remember her gift, but to remind myself of who I still was. At 75, most people expect less. They expect quiet and decline, and endings dressed as routine. But I had just received my real birthday gift, the freedom to choose my ending, and I had chosen one written not in blood, but in love. The day the papers arrived, it rained, a soft, persistent drizzle that tapped against the windows like a metronome, steady, patient, unbothered. I took it as a sign. Rain had always felt cleansing to me. It brought with it a kind of hush, a slowing of the world, as if everything around me had agreed to pause and take notice. The lawyer came just after lunch, his coat damp and shoulders hunched from the weather. He laid the envelope on the dining table as if it were nothing more than a piece of routine paperwork. But to me it felt sacred, like a ribboned package tied with years of quiet hurt and unopened truth. The weight of it wasn't in the paper, it was in what it meant. I waited until the room was empty. No voices in the hallway, no footsteps overhead. Just me and the quiet rain and the steady presence of something I had earned clarity. The nurse passed by once, noticed the envelope, and paused. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked softly. I nodded. She didn't ask to stay, but she didn't leave. She stood there in silence as I opened the envelope. My fingers didn't tremble, not because I wasn't feeling anything, but because this wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a moment of return. I wasn't giving anything away. I was taking something back. The first few pages were procedural, legal language dry as old parchment. Then came the heart of it, the revision. My home, my belongings, my modest savings, not going to the people who had silenced me in my own story, but to the one person who had sat beside me in it. There was a space for my signature, a line simple and quiet, waiting for ink. I picked up the pen. I didn't rush. I thought of my son, his tiny hands gripping mine in church, his first drawing of our house with crooked windows and a giant sun. I thought of all the dinners, the homework at the table, the late-night fevers. I thought of the way he had once called me every Sunday just to hear my voice. And I thought of how long it had been since he'd used that voice to say my name with love. I pressed the pen to paper. Signed. The line absorbed the ink like thirsty soil. It was done. The room didn't erupt in applause. No thunder rolled. But something inside me exhaled, a long, steady breath that had waited years to be released. I looked up. The nurse was still standing there, her eyes glassy but calm. "I hope this doesn't cause trouble," she whispered. I shook my head. It's not about trouble. It's about truth. She knelt down beside me, not as a nurse, not even as a caretaker, but as someone witnessing a moment that mattered. You didn't have to, she said. No, I replied, but I wanted to. She took my hand. I don't need the house, she said. I know, I smiled, but it needs you. That night I sat in the garden. The rain had stopped, but the leaves were still dripping, glistening like tiny lanterns. I watched the way the droplets slid down the petals, and I thought about how long I had waited for someone to choose me. Turns out I had to choose myself first. The papers were filed the next morning. I didn't tell anyone, not the rest of the family, not the ones who had once cared only about what was left behind. Let them find out on their own. Let them feel the absence of what they had assumed would be theirs. Because legacy isn't about blood. It's about presence. And I had given mine to the only one who had earned it. The news was out by Thursday. I didn't tell them directly, but word spreads fast in families like mine ones, that orbit around inheritance more tightly than love. My lawyer had filed the documents, sent a courtesy notice. I imagine there were emails, maybe even a call. Not from me. I was done being the messenger of my own heartache. I waited, though. I won't pretend I didn't. Some part of me still hoped that when my son found out, he would pick up the phone, not in anger, not in protest, but in something like reflection. That he'd call and ask why. Or maybe not even ask. Maybe just listen. I would have told him everything if he'd given me the space. But the phone didn't ring. Not that day, not the next, not even a bitter, begrudging text to say, "So you've made your choice." Silence. And not the kind that soothes, the kind that echoes. I sat in the garden holding the same teacup I always did, looking at the small shoots, just beginning to push up through the soil. We'd planted them together, me and the nurse, just days before. Basil lavender, a few marigolds for memory's sake. They were already reaching for the light, unaware of the tension, thick in the air beyond this patch of earth. The nurse came out with a book tucked under her arm. She didn't ask about the phone. She didn't mention the family. She simply said, "Want to read outside today?" And that was that. I nodded. She read to me for a while. Something about a woman who lived alone by the sea, who collected wind in glass jars and memories in seashells. I didn't catch every word. I was too busy watching the sky, watching the clouds drift like soft departures. But her voice settled around me like a warm shawl. Later that evening, I checked the phone again. Still nothing. And strangely, I didn't feel hurt. I felt confirmed. Because sometimes the absence is the answer. If he had called, maybe I would have explained. Maybe I would have folded the pain back in, softened it, given him space to mend what he had left broken for so long. But he didn't. He didn't even try. And that told me everything. It wasn't about the house. It never was. It was about who showed up when nothing was required. About who listened, not because they wanted something, but because they valued you, and he hadn't done that in years. So no, I didn't regret signing the papers. I regretted waiting so long to believe I had the right. That evening, I went to my desk and pulled out one of the old birthday cards he had written me. I read it once more. "Love you forever. Ma." Then I folded it gently and placed it in a wooden box along with a few old photographs. I didn't throw it out. I'm not made of stone. But I didn't keep it on the shelf anymore. I gave it a resting place where it could sleep beside the other things that once were. When I told the nurse I hadn't heard from him, she didn't frown. She didn't fill the silence with platitudes. She simply said, "Some people only notice when the well runs dry." I looked at her and smiled. He's been walking past water for years and still dying of thirst. She nodded. "You can't make someone drink." I shook my head. "No. but I can stop leaving out the cup. We sat there in shared quiet, watching the light fade. I knew then, with complete certainty, that the phone would not ring, that he would carry his own bitterness, build his own story about why things happened the way they did. He might never understand that it wasn't punishment. It was protection of my peace, of my dignity, of what remained of me. And if he ever did call, well, I would answer. I always would. But I would no longer wait. It didn't happen with a grand renovation or a splash of new paint. The house didn't transform overnight, but something in it changed quietly, steadily, like a breath, drawn deeper than before, like life returning to a room that had long forgotten how to exhale. The nurse, now no longer just the nurse in my mind, had begun planting more than seeds. She was laying down roots, not with announcements or claims, but with care, with consistency. The kitchen grew warmer. She began baking small things, muffins, loaves, cookies, dusted in cinnamon. The scent would drift through the halls like memory itself, gentle and grounding. Music played more often, soft instrumental pieces, old love songs. Once I caught her humming something familiar, and when I asked, she said it was a lullaby her grandmother used to sing. It sounded just like the one I'd sung to my son when he was still small enough to be held against my chest. The guest room became hers, though she never called it that. She began placing small tokens around it. A book on the nightstand, a scarf draped across the back of the chair, a photo of her grandmother beside the lamp. Nothing ostentatious, but it shifted the energy. The room stopped being a spare. It became part of the home. And I began to feel less like an occupant and more like a person again. We started having dinner together most nights. Real conversation, not just functional questions about medicine or appointments. She asked me about my childhood, about the first boy I ever kissed, about what my mother used to cook when I was sick. No one had asked me those things in years. She listened like every answer mattered. Sometimes I caught myself laughing, really laughing, the kind that shakes you a little, that makes you forget the lines on your face. Once I laughed so hard I had to put down my tea. I wiped my eyes and said I haven't laughed like that since, and then stopped, because the truth was I couldn't remember. She looked at me, her smile wide and proud. Then we'll do it again tomorrow. We fixed the garden together, one bed at a time. The marigolds bloomed first, then the basil. The lavender was slower, more stubborn, but when it flowered, it filled the yard with a perfume that made my eyes sting, with something too big for words. One afternoon, as we sat beside the blooms, she said, "This place feels like it's waking up." I looked around. The wind played gently through the branches. The sunlight caught in the petals. "No," I said, "it's remembering." The rooms began to feel full, not with clutter or people, but with presence, with the kind of energy that only arrives when love is present in the walls, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind you can feel in a freshly made bed, in the tea already steeping before you ask, in the photo hung straight, in the shoes neatly aligned at the door. One evening, as we washed dishes together, she turned to me and asked, "Do you ever miss them?" It was an honest question, not cruel, not accusatory. I dried my hands and thought for a moment. "I miss who I thought they were," I said, "but not who they became." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her presence was the answer to every absence. There are still hard days, days when my body aches a little more, when the phone remains silent, when I see a shadow on the porch, and for half a second wonder if it might be him. But those moments pass, because I no longer wait. I no longer long for what has long since let go of me. Instead, I water the plants. I set the table. I hum, While folding laundry, I sit in the garden and feel the sun on my skin. I read aloud to someone who listens. I wake up in a house that has grown tender around me again. This home was built once by love, and now, because I chose to share it with someone who saw me when I was invisible, it is being rebuilt by kindness. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And there is no greater inheritance than that.